As mentioned in the last application support session, we're moving into some more targeted sessions for the next 5 sessions, covering off some of the bigger functionality and processes on accounts themselves within FinPower Connect. Today we're covering payment arrangements, promises and additional payments. Next will be refinances, followed by restructures, and then current versus contractual overdue, and then withdrawals and refunds. To use the idiom, there are many ways to skin a cat, seems appropriate for this particular topic, as in FinPower Connect there are many ways to achieve various payment-related outcomes. Therefore, it's important that we look at the different areas that cater for payment changes and the different scenarios clients are likely to need to cater for and how this can be achieved within FinPower Connect. Unless you're completing a restructure or are changing the minimum payment basis and related settings on a revolving credit account, the majority of payment-related changes are being made using the payment arrangement wizard or widget. There is sometimes a bit of confusion in this area because the wizard is called the account payment arrangement wizard, whether you're making a payment arrangement, adding payment promises as part of that process, adding additional or overriding payments, or using the alternate schedule. So we'll start off with a brief overview about what each of these are and then go through the wizards and have a look at some example scenarios. So the definitions, by basic definition in the context of FinPower Connect, the term payment arrangement means an adjustment to a borrower's payments and is a reference to the wizard as mentioned before. This could be an amendment or variation to a borrower's regular instalments, adding payments to clear arrears, adding extra payments at the borrower's request, or overriding regular payments. Payment promises add extra payments that do not impact the overdue balance. The easy way to remember this is in its name. It's simply a promise to make a payment on a date. These can be good for things like clearing overdue balances or arrears. Overriding payments. There are technically 3 different types of overriding payments that can be added by the Overriding Payments tab, which we will see soon. Understanding how each of these impacts the balances and behaviours of the related processes is important. Regular, amending the amount of one or more regular payments or a series of regular payments can be completed as an overriding payment. Additional, which adds extra payments usually on a date that is not a regular payment date. The additional payments will be due on the date selected, so the payment due will increase the overdue balance until it is paid. And the promise, as mentioned, adding promises can also be added via the Overriding Payments tab, and the promises are not actually due on the selected date, so payments made will only reduce the overdue balance of the loan when physically paid. So where can the payment arrangement wizard be accessed from in FinPower Connect? Before we launch into more of the specifics, I thought we would cover the locations where the account payment arrangement wizard can be found throughout FinPower Connect. As many already know, this wizard is represented by a lovely little red heart icon. So wherever this is displayed, either the payment arrangement wizard or in some places, the cut down version, the payment promise wizard, can be accessed. In this image, we can see displayed the following areas. The actions menu throughout, and when I say actions menu, I refer to the section on the left-hand side of most of the forms in FinPower Connect with the label of actions. The exception to that being on a workflow where the payment arrangement actually appears under other actions. It's also available via the edit menu, which I'm not sure how many people use this on a regular basis, but there is an action section down here and you can access payment arrangement and payment promise from here. The key to this being when you've got the right form open, because this menu is dynamic and will change. You'll also see them appear on what we call button strips, which are found on forms below grids or summaries, like in the following locations. So the accounts payments page, we've got a little red love heart down the bottom here. Clicking this will launch the wizard. And then we've got the Task Manager button strip, specifically on a workflow related folder. You can see the little love heart there as well. You'll also see the icon appear in summaries and grids throughout to indicate arrangements have been made or that promises are due. So these examples here will show some of those places. For example, the events block on the key details summary page, the current schedule, which can be accessed via the schedule button on the financial page, and many, many more. In addition to the little red heart icon, there's also some additional buttons which are available on the payments page, as well as a view current, which won't launch the wizard, but it will pop up a window with a summary containing the information of the account's current arrangement. And on revolving credit accounts, a cancel payment arrangement button. They can also be set to appear as a workflow item as shown here. Moving on to the processing side of things now, we'll have a look at each part of the payment arrangement wizard. When you launch the wizard, the very first steps are to enter the basics, like the date the arrangement is being made, who is completing the arrangement, or alternatively, you can select the borrower who requested it in this field, and any additional information that may be desired depending on the client's business requirements. For example, they may wish to use for their users to select a type for various reasons, such as custom reporting purposes, or to use as a trigger or flag for another process. A quick example of that could be a custom script that looks for accounts with payment arrangements of a particular type and takes an action based on that type, as is the case in the comprehensive credit reporting setup in Australia for hardship arrangements as an example. There is an option to use this type as a way to report on accounts in hardship or that have been through a variation process. If a type is desired, the configuration of the attached information list may be required. This can be amended as necessary in the informations list admin library. In my example here, I've added 4 different types just to give an idea of what this could be used for. This list can also be made mandatory, so a user is forced to enter a type before progressing through the wizard. And there's an option to limit this to a list so that the user cannot free type in this field. And those settings are on the general page on the information list itself, which, as it's an admin library, cannot normally be amended by most users. Once most of the basics have been completed, including whether or not to print a payment arrangement letter, the user can progress to the next stage. Completing a payment arrangement in its simplest form, using the second page of the wizard under the payment section at the top, this section changes the regular payment details. Depending on the account type options and the user's permissions, as part of this process, a user can choose whether or not to change the frequency, change the next payment date, add in a balloon payment, choose to set a final date for payments to calculate to, or choose to calculate using the original maturity date. They can also choose whether or not to hold the overdue value or declare it as part of the new arrangement. A user can review what the different options will look like by clicking the Calculate button after selecting or changing different options. This aspect can act as an alternative to a restructure in some circumstances, and a variation document can be generated to cater for the disclosure to the borrower if ticked on the previous page, or can be generated at a later time, which we'll go over in more detail in due course. We're looking at the Summary tab on this page at the moment, but you'll notice the top section here remains static as we review the subsequent tabs. As we move on to the next tab, Payment Promises, as part of the Account Payment Arrangement wizard, as mentioned, the top section remains unchanged, which allows the user to add a promise, but also to change the top section and recalculate if required. As touched on earlier, a payment promise will add payments that do not impact the overdue balance. In other words, it doesn't add a payment due as such in terms of updating the overdue balance, and will not flag as overdue if the payment is not made. It is intended to be a facility that allows payments to be made that a borrower has agreed to, but not an amendment to their loan terms as such. For example, these types of payments may be used to catch up on an arrears balance on the account where you would not necessarily want it to add to the overdue balance if missed. This doesn't mean it can't be flagged in a different way, however, which I'll go through shortly. To add a payment promise, the details are entered in the lower section of this tab, and there are a few little features here that come in handy. There's an option to clear any existing promises on the account and the following fields that can be used. In the total field, this allows a total balance to be entered. For example, the current amount overdue. You'll notice when using this wizard that this is the value that pre-populates in the italic grey text. You can choose to override that amount or right-click and use the paste hint function or simply leave it blank. If the business has a standard arrangement timeframe for collections, as an example, like 4 weeks, you could opt to enter the number of payments down here into this field, as shown in the image here. The little calculator button next to it will then, when clicked, automatically calculate the value required to repay the total amount over the number of payments specified. Very handy little feature. To finalise the promise, you must click the Add Promise button. Once you've clicked the Add Promise button, you'll be able to see they've been added to the schedule and are now viewable on the summary page. At this point, you should click Finish and the letter would generate to send to the borrower to confirm the changes made. There is more to the account payment arrangement wizard, but we'll come back to this after this section. While we're on the subject of payment promises, and you'll have noticed the subject up the top has changed, there is the cut down version of the wizard that I mentioned. There may be some circumstances where a business does not want the end user to be able to change the regular instalments, or where they only want the promise options to be available. This is where the account payment promise wizard option comes in handy. There are several permissions that relate to this area, one of those being to allow a role access to one wizard but not the other, as an example. Where that is the case, the end user will only see the Add Promise options in the Actions menu and on the Payments page, etc. And the following wizard will launch. On the first page, it is the same pretty much as the Account Payment Arrangement wizard, except for the title at the top. The next page on the Summary tab is where things start to look a little bit different. You can see that the regular payment section remains at the top, but it cannot be amended, as in it is read only. There is no final payment options or the option to hold the overdue value either. On the Add Promise tab, it's business as usual for the most part, though you'll notice the overdue value has come through as expected, as has the frequency and dates, etc. You can amend the frequency and dates if required to override the pre-populated suggestions in either wizard, and as mentioned, can use the Calculate button to calculate the overdue over a set number of payments. You can enter a dollar amount in the value field, like in this image here. In this example, we've entered $50, and if we click the Add Promise button, it automatically pre-populates the number it thinks would be required to clear the overdue value. So in this case, 79 promises to pay. If we look at the overriding payments page in the account payment promise wizard, we can see it looks a little bit funny here. And this is because when we've added the promise in that way, it's added the 79 promises based on the full overdue value divided by 50. And it hasn't necessarily taken into consideration the regular payments. Where any promises to be paid are added after the account reaches a zero balance, this wizard will automatically cancel them. So that is what that one looks like there. The overriding payment tab also allows you to adjust payments on an individual basis if the borrower is requiring something other than even promised payments, or the agreement is to pay a certain amount for the first 4 weeks and then change to a different value after that, as an example. Once again, once you click Finish, the user will get the letter will be generated, but in this instance, they will also get a warning as shown over here to confirm that they are aware of the impacts of the promise that they are adding. In this case, it will say any payments after a certain date will not be made, etc. They can then continue with the payment arrangement and move on. Do a little bit of promise management now. So I mentioned it doesn't impact the overdues. So because they do not impact the overdue balances, other methods of measuring whether or not a borrower has kept to their promised payments may be required. There is a sample script supplied with FinPower Connect that caters for this and can be customised further if it does not entirely suit the needs of the business. I'll go over what the sample script can do and show where this is run, which is just usually with the account processors, and reflected on for the user to see or act on. Just zoom this out a little bit. The name of the script, as you may have already guessed, is the ap.patprom script, and it shows one way in which the success or failure of promises to pay can be measured. Specifically, the script will compare an expected overdue balance with the overdue balance as at the date the script is run, taking into consideration any grace days if relevant. The expected overdue balance is calculated as the overdue at the time of the arrangement and anything due to date less any promises plus any extra fees. The test is then pretty simply, is the overdue balance greater than the expected overdue balance? If the result is true, then the promise is failed. From there, the script can check if it's the first failure or not, and depending on the other options set, for example, the option for the broken count on the constants page of the script down here, and our example is set to 2. If it had more than 2 failed promises, the promise as a whole would now be set to broken. Depending on further configuration, this could mean that action is taken on a workflow to recall it immediately and set a flag, or a log could be added with an action date so that it appears for action in the task manager. There's other things the script can do, but we don't have the time to go through it all today, so we strongly recommend that you give it a whirl and test it out. As always, this is a sample script and should be properly evaluated to confirm it is fit for purpose for the client's business requirements. In addition to appearing in the task manager, the promise statuses can be viewed on the account as well in a few different ways. On the payments page in the summary, you'll see the promise colors under overriding payments and a warning that a promise has been broken, as an example. Likewise, a warning is displayed if the promise is broken on the key details page under the financial status. And there are additional columns in the transactions page that can be added using your column chooser and will display passes and fails and the associated colors, etc. And as mentioned just before, if broken, a log can be added automatically with an action date that will then appear in the task manager for a user to review, as shown here. Coming full circle now, back to the payment arrangement wizard and the overriding payments tab. As mentioned earlier, there are 3 types of overriding payments that can be added, and one of the ways these can be added is via this tab in this wizard. This image here shows some regular payments that have been overridden. This example is a fixed term floating rate account, and you may recall if you have seen the session on that loan class that overriding regular payments can be added where required following a floating interest rate change. We won't rehash that completely, but this has been the case for this loan thus far and is one of the potentially many reasons for adding overriding payments. There are two others of additional and promise as shown here. We've covered promise already, obviously, but additional has its own role to play. Additional payments differ from promises in that they do impact the overdue balance, and if a payment is missed, it will in turn cause the account to become overdue and trigger any related processes that have been configured, whether that be in the account type rules with various actions or adding workflows and so on. Additional payments can be good for adding extra payments that you need to behave in a similar way to regular payments, but on a different date or frequency for whatever reason. There is also the option in this tab to select manual, which will stop any direct debits being created for payments flagged as manual, and so is an important one to be aware of. Before we leave this wizard behind and this tab behind, I just want to quickly point out the fun little features and helpers that this tab has. Firstly, you have the ability to add a series of overriding regular payments by using date expressions, as we saw with the top one there. Don't panic if that sounds a little scary, because we are here to help. I know I've mentioned this once or twice before, but there are some excellent tooltips already built into FinPower Connect by our developers, and they're often signaled by these little eye icons, as we can see here next to the word overriding payments. This one's a goodie, and it explains how you can write these date expressions to achieve the result that you're after for regular payments. If that disappears a little bit too quick for you, there's also a decent section in our online help, which you can get to by pressing F1 on your keyboard from the screen. Secondly, there is a button strip below the grid, and there's some helpful tools such as the green plus button, which if clicked will add regular payment lines for all future payment dates with blank values ready and waiting to be overridden. In help, there is a full explanation of the button strip too, which is really handy if you can't remember what each of them do. But as mentioned, if you hover over them, they'll give you a clue as well. Once you've got your list of overriding payments, where's the full one? Here we go. You can update the lines as you need to. For example, if a client requested to amend their regular instalment for a couple of months to pay their balance down faster, you could choose to override those payments and then stop where required. To save time, you can use the copy cell down function or use the keyboard shortcut Control and W. To get rid of any leftover blank payments and return to the normal scheduled payments, the little paintbrush icon down here will clear any blank payments from that list automatically for you. Then if required, you can use the calculate button again up the top. And if you're wanting to maintain that original payment date or that set final payment date, it'll recalculate the remaining regular payments automatically for you. Once you're finished, if you click finish, a letter will generate, which leads us to the sample APA document. So as we've mentioned in the loan class sessions and the document session, there are some special events where document templates can be configured to be triggered when that event takes place. In this case, FinPower Connect comes with a sample document labelled the APA or Account Payment Arrangement document that has some built-in features to make disclosing payment variations generated by these payment arrangements and payment promises easier. Because it is a sample document, it must be thoroughly checked by the site to confirm it is fit for purpose for their needs in terms of content and that it meets their legislative disclosure requirements under the CCCFA or NCCPA. From time to time, development do make additions to these sample documents or to FinPower Connect directly if necessary, based on legislative changes. However, as mentioned, these are to aid in making this easier and should not be explicitly used without the right checks having been undertaken first. Now that I've said that, I'll show you very briefly some of what is built in currently. So the document comes preset with some constants already so that the site can decide what they do want to display if they deem it relevant. For example, you can choose whether or not, see if I can zoom that in a little bit, to show the variation summary and what to include in it. Like if we have a look at this document here, equally as small, but this is very easy to generate yourself in your own test database. This one shows an example of what can be produced where a promise is in play, a little promise summary, plus the variation summary after that. You may not want to have both, as it does also include the promise payments in that table there. So these are both generated based on what I have set in the constants and what options I have selected within the payment arrangement wizard on that account. Again, as mentioned, we strongly suggest having a good test of this one with the various options to confirm what will or won't suit your clients best and to highlight any custom work they may require. It's also important to note that some of the changes with this are very recent, and TIFF Power Connect, which is now storing some additional information about previous arrangements, I think largely in part to the CCCFA disclosure changes in New Zealand. But there's plenty of Knowledgebase articles about it for those who want to know more. In addition to the manual ways to process payment changes, there are also some system-related processes that will add a payment arrangement to alter repayments. Where this occurs, the source of the payment arrangement will be updated accordingly to indicate how the user, to the user how these changes occurred. These are reflected on the Payment Arrangement tab itself as shown here, and the alternative sources you're likely to come across are the following. So the interest rate change, which we covered in our last loan class session. Payment review, again for the fixed term floating rate loans. This is updated when committing changes in the loan payment review wizard as we covered last session. Restructure, which tends to be fixed term loans only, and another alternate source is withdrawals. So at the end of the withdrawal wizard, you have the opportunity to adjust the repayments as well. And it's important to note with this one that this page will not appear if your account processes are not up to date. The two remaining sources are, of course, payment arrangement and payment promise, which are set depending on which type is valid and the method being used to add the arrangement. In addition to that, we also have some auditing available, which is optional, and if you have it set on, as previously mentioned in another session, under global settings, it will add a little audit trail for you here, including the changes that have been made. Now, the related permissions, as mentioned, there are quite a few in this area. We won't go through them all individually, but just as a quick overview, sometimes a client, as mentioned, will need a solution not catered for out of the box. They may, sorry, I'm just getting ahead of myself. So as I said earlier, you can choose whether or not a user may have access to the promise wizard or the payment arrangement wizard, and this is one of the ways in which you can do that. Now moving back to my customization, sometimes a client will need a solution that's not catered for quite out of the box, and they may want additional information recorded or more controls over specific functions, etc. And in this instance, a custom HTML widget may be used instead of the built-in wizard. They may also require a custom action script to hide the button for the built-in feature and to launch the widget instead. Lastly, we have some reports available for managing promises and things, one of those being the Promise Management Summary widget. This is available out of the box, and if it isn't already added into your task manager as it is in demo data, it's really simple to add. You can import it via the scripts form, add a folder and select HTML widget. As you can see here, there's already loads of built-in columns and a breakdown that appears and includes pass and fail rates that can be broken down by user. In addition to that, there's also the transaction list report with some payment promise options to report on as well. I think that is all I had prepared for you today, and that is payment arrangements in a nutshell. Lastly, any tips and tricks that we've been aware of is just making sure that you're aware of what you've got set on your account type in terms of what is and isn't available, and the option to calculate for the maturity date that comes through every now and again. Using maturity date to calculate remaining payments may not always be possible. Where it's not, it will shift automatically to final date and calculate as close to as possible. A quick example of that would be if the payment frequency had changed, it's not always possible to get it directly on the original maturity date. So we have come to the end of our session for today, and as always, if there's any additional information you seek, don't hesitate to contact application support for user interface queries or code support in relation to any code-specific questions. Next week, as mentioned, we'll be covering refinances.